had been camping plenty of times before. A few nights out in the woods here and there, nothing too crazy. I loved the outdoors, the feeling of being disconnected from the world. But there was something about this trip that felt different right from the start. Maybe it was the new campsite, deep in a less traveled part of the woods, or maybe it was just the unease I couldn't shake off. It started on a Friday morning. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a light breeze, and that crisp edge to the air that makes you feel alive. I packed my gear the night before, carefully checking everything. Tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, flashlight, food, and water. I made sure I wasn't missing anything. I was used to roughing it, so I didn't think much of the long drive to the campsite. The road to the site was less maintained than I expected. It wasn't paved, and the gravel was thick in spots. As I drove, the trees seemed to get denser and denser, until I was no longer sure where the road ended and the wilderness began. It didn't help that the GPS signal started to fail, making me doubt my directions. But I pushed on, trusting my instincts. I had been here once before, many years ago, when I was younger. The forest felt familiar, like an old friend. When I finally arrived, it was around noon. The campsite wasn't much to look at, just a small clearing next to a stream, surrounded by thick woods. There was a fire pit already dug out, and the remains of old campfires scattered around. Nobody else was there. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The air felt still, like it was holding its breath. I set up my tent in the far corner of the clearing, near the trees. The ground was soft but firm, and I made sure the tent was pitched properly. I unpacked my gear and made a small campfire, just enough to cook some lunch. The crackling of the fire was comforting, but something about the silence around me felt unsettling. I couldn't hear birds or any kind of wildlife, which was odd for a place like this. Usually, the woods are full of sounds, chirping, rustling, and the occasional snap of a branch. But here it was eerily quiet. After lunch, I decided to take a walk through the woods. The trail was faint but visible, winding its way between the trees. As I walked, I noticed the ground was soft, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The air was heavy with the scent of pine, but even that felt thicker than usual. I tried to shake off the sense of unease creeping up my spine, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. The further I walked, the more I felt like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My heart rate quickened, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. The trees seemed taller here, their branches hanging low, casting long shadows across the path. I turned around to head back to camp, but when I looked ahead, the path seemed different, longer, twisted. It was almost like the trees were closing in on me, blocking my way. I forced myself to stay calm and retraced my steps. It didn't take long for me to realize I was lost. The trees around me looked unfamiliar, and the sound of my footsteps seemed muffled, like I was walking through thick mud. Panic started to rise, but I forced myself to stay focused. I'd been lost in the woods before, and I knew what to do. The key was to stay calm and find a landmark, something I could recognize to guide me back to camp. I took a deep breath and started looking around. The trees here were thick and old, their trunks gnarled and twisted. I couldn't help but notice how dark the forest had gotten, even though it was only late afternoon. The sun was hidden behind the trees, and the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. Something about the place felt wrong, like the woods themselves didn't want me there. I kept walking, trying to remember the path I had taken. The ground was uneven, and my boots sank into the earth with each step. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me. It was harder to breathe now, like the forest was closing in around me. My anxiety was rising, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I started to think I might never find my way back, I spotted something, a clearing up ahead. It was a small patch of light where the trees opened up. Relief flooded through me, and I hurried toward it. But when I broke through the trees into the clearing, I froze. The clearing wasn't like the one where I had set up camp. It was overgrown, wild, like it hadn't been touched in years. There was a small, crumbling stone structure in the middle of the clearing, half buried in the earth. It looked like an old well, the stones weathered and worn by time. A chill ran down my spine as I approached it, my feet dragging through the tall grass. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened here, something bad. The air around the well felt different, colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know why, but I felt drawn to it. I knelt beside it, looking down into the dark, hollow space. It was too deep to see the bottom, and I wondered just how long it had been here. The thought of falling into it made my stomach churn. I stood up quickly, suddenly feeling very small and vulnerable in this strange, forgotten place. The silence around me seemed to press in, suffocating. I turned to leave the clearing, but as I did, I saw something in the trees. A movement, a shadow that didn't quite belong. I froze again, staring into the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sound, nothing to indicate what I had seen. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. But I knew I had seen something or someone. My mind raced, trying to explain it away, but there was no logical reason for it. Without thinking, I turned and bolted back toward the path, my feet slipping on the uneven ground. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer together as I ran. I didn't dare look back. My only focus was getting back to camp, to the safety of my tent. When I finally stumbled back into the clearing where my camp was, I felt a mix of relief and dread. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. The fire had burned down to embers, and the shadows seemed deeper than before. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my gear, packed up my tent, and made the decision to leave. I wasn't going to stay another night in that place. Something had happened out there in the woods, something I couldn't explain. But I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to be there when night fell. I left the campsite as quickly as I could, not looking back once. The road back felt endless, like the forest was swallowing me whole. By the time I reached the main road and saw the familiar sign of the town in the distance, I felt like I had escaped something. Something that had been watching me, waiting. I didn't talk about the trip to anyone. I didn't need to. They wouldn't understand. It wasn't just a bad camping experience. It was something more. Something I couldn't quite explain, but something that had left a mark on me. I've never gone back to those woods, and I don't think I ever will. Some places, no matter how beautiful, are better left alone. And some things, no matter how hard you try, can't be outrun. I had always been drawn to the solitude of nature. There was something about being in the woods, away from the constant noise and distractions of the modern world, that gave me a sense of peace. It wasn't until recently, though, that I realized how easily that peace could turn into something far more unnerving. I had planned this camping trip alone, wanting to disconnect completely for a weekend. I had my tent, my gear, and plenty of food to last me 2 days in the wild. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a crisp autumn breeze, and the forest was alive with the colors of the changing leaves. It seemed like the perfect getaway, and I couldn't have been more excited. The campsite I chose was tucked deep in the woods, far away from any other campers. I had read about it online, a place that promised solitude and natural beauty, an escape from the typical, overcrowded spots. The trail leading to it was a bit more challenging than I had expected, but that only added to the adventure. It was exactly what I needed. I arrived at the site by late afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The camp area was situated near a small creek, the water trickling over rocks with a soft, calming sound. The perfect spot to set up my tent. I took my time, carefully staking the corners, making sure everything was secure. The air was cool, and the faint smell of pine and damp earth hung around me. Once my tent was set up, I unpacked the rest of my gear. The sound of the creek and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind were the only noises, and I found it oddly comforting. As the sun sank lower, I gathered some firewood and started a small fire in the fire pit. I sat down, leaning back against a log, watching the flames dance. There was a simple satisfaction in the crackling sound of burning wood, the warmth it gave off, and the flickering shadows that played across the forest. Night fell quickly. The forest grew darker, and the chirps of crickets and the occasional call of an owl filled the air. The temperature dropped, but the fire kept me warm enough. I ate a simple meal, nothing fancy, just some jerky, trail mix, and a hot cup of tea. The kind of meal you only need when you're out in the wild, far from civilization. As I sat there alone, the serenity of the place began to wrap around me like a thick blanket. But as the night deepened, something about the woods started to feel off. It was subtle at first, a slight unease, a sense that I wasn't truly alone. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as just my imagination. The wind rustled through the trees, and I told myself it was just the forest settling in for the night. But the feeling didn't go away. It wasn't until later, after I had finished my meal and the fire was starting to die down, that I first heard it. A faint noise, almost like a footstep, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. I froze, straining my ears. I was alone, right? I glanced around, half expecting to see someone stepping into the firelight, but there was nothing, just the shifting shadows and the quiet gurgle of the creek. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The noise was probably just a branch snapping under the weight of something moving through the underbrush. But the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I became. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch just a bit further than they should. The wind picked up, but it did nothing to chase away the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, but sleep wouldn't come. I spent the next hour tossing and turning in my tent, the noise of the forest outside now seeming much more sinister. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, felt like it was someone or something just out of sight, observing me. I checked the zippers on my tent, making sure everything was secure, but the paranoia was building. Eventually, I decided to step outside for a moment, hoping the cold air would clear my head. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the dark woods, keeping close to the firelight. The forest was still, the shadows longer now, stretching deep into the trees. The noise I'd heard earlier was gone, but the sense of being watched had only grown stronger. I stood there, looking around, wondering if I had just been imagining things. The flashlight beam flickered as I swept it across the area, illuminating patches of dark earth and the occasional glint of water. There was nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the distant croak of a frog by the creek. But then, as I turned to head back to my tent, I saw something that made my heart stop. At the edge of the light, barely visible among the trees, was a figure. It was so faint that I thought I might have been seeing things at first, but then the figure moved. It wasn't much, just a blur of dark clothes or shadow, blending with the trees, but it was unmistakable. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. For a moment, I thought it was just another camper, but this didn't feel like a normal encounter. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't moving like a person. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost like it was studying me. My pulse quickened. I wanted to call out, ask if someone needed help, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. All I could do was watch as the shadow slowly disappeared back into the woods. No rustling of leaves, no footsteps. It just vanished. I didn't wait around. I turned and rushed back to my tent, heart pounding in my chest. The fire seemed so far away, its light dimming in the distance as I dove inside my tent and zipped it shut. I lay there, in the dark, not moving. Every creak of the tent felt like someone was outside, just waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night, not even an hour. I just listened to the silence, the occasional creak of trees in the wind, and the soft murmur of the creek. But my mind kept replaying that shadow, that movement just beyond the light. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. I hadn't gotten any sleep, but I told myself I'd pack up and leave first thing. The sun rose, but it didn't bring the comfort I'd hoped for. The forest felt different in the daylight, less mysterious, but still unsettling. I packed up my gear slowly, trying to keep my composure, but every sound made me flinch. I was almost done packing when I noticed something strange. The ground around my campsite was littered with broken twigs and disturbed dirt, as though someone had walked through the area during the night. But I hadn't heard anything. No footsteps, no sounds of movement. I stood there, staring at the marks on the ground, trying to convince myself it was just an animal again. But something about the way the marks were laid out made it feel deliberate. I finished packing in a hurry, not wanting to linger any longer. I barely looked around as I walked back down the trail to the parking lot, my eyes focused on the path in front of me. The sun was high in the sky now, and the woods seemed peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. That feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It was with me, still hanging in the air, like an unshakable cloud. When I finally reached my car, I slammed the door shut behind me and drove off, the forest disappearing in the rearview mirror. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there, that there was someone or something watching me. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was just the isolation of the woods playing tricks on me. But I'll never be sure, and that uncertainty is what haunts me the most. I haven't been back to that spot since. The memories of that night linger, a reminder that sometimes, even in the most beautiful and peaceful places, there are things that are best left unseen. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. The idea of getting away from the noise and chaos of daily life, disconnecting from everything, and just being surrounded by nature felt like the perfect escape. The plan was simple: a weekend solo hike and camp out in a secluded area deep in the woods. I'd picked a spot near a small creek, one that was far enough away from the main trails to offer a sense of solitude, but still within my skill level as far as hiking went. The trailhead was about a 2-hour drive from my house, and the weather was supposed to be perfect: clear skies, mild temperatures, and a light breeze. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and my trusty knife, and set out early in the morning, making my way to the parking lot where the trail began. The road to the trailhead was winding and bumpy, but it didn't bother me. I was in good spirits, eager to get out there. I parked the car and started my hike, the only sounds around me being the crunch of gravel beneath my boots and the occasional bird call echoing through the trees. The hike itself was more demanding than I anticipated. The path, though marked clearly with signs, was overgrown in places, and the terrain became uneven and rocky the farther I went. But I didn't mind. Kept me focused, kept me moving forward. I only stopped to take a drink from my water bottle or adjust my backpack as I made my way deeper into the woods. As the hours passed, I found myself alone in a quiet, peaceful place, the kind of isolation that made everything feel timeless. By the time I arrived at my campsite, the sun was beginning to dip low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The spot was perfect. It was nestled between 2 large boulders, with a view of the creek just a few yards away. I set up my tent first, taking my time to make sure everything was secure. I wasn't in a rush. The creek provided a soothing backdrop to the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, I started a small fire, the flames crackling in the cool evening air. I cooked a simple meal: some canned beans, trail mix, and a few crackers, sitting by the fire and savoring the warmth it offered. The night was quiet, almost eerily so. There were no sounds of other campers, no voices carrying through the air. It was just me, the fire, and the forest. After eating, I sat for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the clear sky. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost. As I sat there, I noticed how quickly the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me. The trees loomed tall, their silhouettes stretching high into the sky. The night felt thick, heavy, as if the weight of the woods pressed in on me. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the minutes ticked by, a strange sense of unease settled over me. The quiet had become oppressive, unnatural. The wind had died down completely, leaving everything still. I found myself glancing around, but all I could see were the shadows of the trees, the flickering orange light of the fire, and the occasional movement of small animals darting in and out of the underbrush. I tried to shake off the feeling. I was alone, sure, but that was the whole point of this trip, to get away, to experience solitude. So why did it feel so wrong? I decided to head to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would clear my head. The inside of my tent was small but cozy, just enough room for me to curl up in my sleeping bag. As I lay there, the silence was deafening. The only sounds were the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. I rolled over, trying to get comfortable, but my mind wouldn't shut off. Something about the stillness kept gnawing at me. It must have been around midnight when I heard it, the first real noise since I'd arrived. A rustling sound, like something large moving through the underbrush near my campsite. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. It came again, closer this time, like something heavy was pushing its way through the trees. I could feel my heart start to race, and I cursed under my breath, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal, I thought. The wind had picked up again, but it didn't seem strong enough to carry the sound of something so large. I lay there, tense, waiting for the noise to stop, but it didn't. It kept coming, circling around the campsite, growing closer, then moving farther away, only to return again. My mind was racing, and the quiet of the night seemed to amplify every small sound, every shift of the air. I had my knife with me, but it felt like an inadequate defense against whatever it was that was out there. Eventually, the noise stopped. I listened for several long minutes, but all I could hear was the wind. It was then that I noticed how dark it had become inside the tent. The fire outside had burned down to embers, and the flickering light had all but disappeared. The air felt colder, too. I decided to risk it. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, trying to peer into the night. The campfire was now just a pile of glowing coals, casting an eerie red light. I could see nothing else, only the dark outline of trees against the sky. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something. A figure standing near the edge of the firelight, just outside the reach of the warmth. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. There was no sound, no movement, just the figure standing there, unmoving. The shape was tall, too tall to be a regular animal, and yet it was impossible to make out any details. It was like a shadow, darker than the night around it. My mind raced. Was it a person? A bear? Some kind of animal that I didn't recognize? I stayed perfectly still, unsure of what to do. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the woods, vanishing without a sound. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and shone the beam across the campsite. There was nothing there. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. It was like the figure had never been there at all. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the darkness and the quiet had gotten to me. Maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. But as I lay back down in the tent, trying to ignore the cold knot of fear in my stomach, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. Something had been out there, waiting, and now it was gone. But not for good. I had the nagging feeling that it would be back. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the trees, every shift of the wind, made my heart race. But when morning finally came, and the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, the world felt different. The tension that had hung in the air the night before was gone, replaced by the soft sounds of the forest waking up. I packed up my things quickly, eager to get moving. The hike back was long and quiet, my mind replaying the events of the night. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to stay another night in that forest. When I reached the trailhead, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was back in the world of people, where the sounds of civilization could drown out the noise in my head. The hike had been meant to be an escape, a way to connect with nature and find peace. But instead, it had left me with an uneasy feeling, a sense that something had been lurking in the woods all along, just beyond the edge of the firelight. I looked back at the trail one last time before getting into my car. It was still early enough that the morning mist clung to the trees, making everything look even more mysterious. For a brief moment, I wondered if I'd ever come back to that spot again. And then, as I drove away, I couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the forest that had been watching me. Maybe it had been something else entirely. It was late in the afternoon when I finally set up camp. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows through the thick trees that surrounded me. I had decided to take a solo trip into the mountains, hoping for some solitude and a chance to clear my head. The weather had been perfect, crisp but not too cold, with a light breeze stirring the leaves. The kind of day that seemed made for hiking. I had been planning the trip for months, gathering the right gear, reading up on the best trails, and even choosing a remote site that wasn't too popular. I didn't want to see anyone. I just wanted to be alone with my thoughts. The trail had been rugged, winding its way through dense patches of forest, up rocky ridges, and across clear streams. I passed only a few hikers along the way, each of us acknowledging each other with a quick nod before going on our separate paths. By the time I reached the campsite, the sky was turning a soft orange. I decided to set up near a small creek that ran through the area. The sound of water babbling over the rocks would be soothing during the night. My tent was easy to pitch. I had done it countless times before. I spread out my sleeping bag inside, making sure the small stove and cooler were within reach. The fire pit was already there, a ring of stones that had clearly been used before. I wasn't sure if anyone else had camped here recently, but the fire pit looked well used, as if it had been a while since the last campers had left. The first task was to gather firewood. I hadn't hiked too far from the main trail, so I didn't want to risk running out of fuel for the fire. I wandered a bit, collecting dry sticks and branches that had fallen from the trees. It wasn't long before I had a nice little pile stacked up by the fire pit. Once I had the fire going, I settled into my camp chair with a cup of hot coffee. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the crisp mountain air. Everything felt peaceful, just the way I had imagined it. There was no rush, no obligations, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the water trickling by. I had planned to stay for 2 nights. The first night was always the easiest. The excitement of being out in nature, the novelty of the surroundings. It was the second night that always made me nervous. There was something about being so far from civilization that left me on edge. But that was why I came out here, right? To challenge myself. The sun eventually disappeared behind the mountains, and the temperature dropped quickly. I threw on a jacket and moved closer to the fire. The stars above were incredibly clear, the kind of night sky you could only get in places far from city lights. The crickets were chirping in the distance, and a couple of owls hooted in the trees. It was around this time that I started to feel a strange unease. I couldn't quite place it, but something about the forest felt different. It was quiet, too quiet. The sounds of the evening seemed to fade in and out, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that I was being paranoid, but the feeling lingered. The fire crackled in front of me as I stared into the flames, my mind drifting. I had brought a book, but I didn't feel like reading. I didn't feel like doing much of anything. Just sitting there trying to shake off the feeling of being observed. When the night was fully settled in, I went to my tent, zipped up the entrance, and lay down on my sleeping bag. I listened to the sounds of the night, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the distant, ever-present sound of the creek. But sleep wouldn't come easily. I kept hearing something, a movement in the forest, branches cracking underfoot, the soft rustling of leaves. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, deer, maybe a fox, or even a raccoon, but my gut told me otherwise. The sounds were too deliberate, too close. I held my breath, straining to listen, but everything fell silent again. The air was still, my pulse quickened, and I tried to push the thought out of my mind. It wasn't anything. It was just my imagination running wild in the dark. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up with the first rays of light, feeling groggy but relieved that the night had passed. The unease I had felt before still lingered, but I pushed it aside. I had to get up and keep moving. I couldn't let fear control me. I made myself breakfast, a quick oatmeal and some coffee, and packed up my gear. The day was already warmer than the previous evening had been, and the sun was creeping up over the treetops. I decided to go for a short hike, maybe take my mind off things. I didn't want to stay at camp all day and let the isolation get to me. The hike was quiet. I followed the trail through the trees, not really thinking about where I was going, just putting one foot in front of the other. The forest here was dense, with tall pines and thick underbrush that made the trail feel like a tunnel through the trees. I wasn't used to being so deep in the woods. Normally, I camped in more open areas, but the solitude here was something I had craved. Still, something didn't sit right with me. Around midday, I stopped for a rest by a small clearing. The sunlight filtered through the branches above, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. I sat on a rock, pulled out a granola bar, and took a drink of water. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt. They weren't animal tracks. They were too large, too deliberate. Human tracks. My heart skipped a beat. I knelt down, studying them carefully. They looked fresh, maybe only a day or two old, and they were heading in the same direction I had been walking. It was a small trail, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and it appeared to lead further into the woods. My first thought was that someone else had camped nearby, maybe another solo hiker. But then I realized that the tracks didn't make sense. They weren't following the main trail. They veered off it, deep into the forest, toward a part of the woods that seemed to grow even darker, denser. I stood up slowly, my pulse racing. I glanced around, but all I could see were trees, a dense forest stretching out in every direction. I thought about turning back, but something, curiosity, maybe, drove me forward. I wasn't going to let a set of footprints scare me off, not after everything I had been through to get here. So I kept walking, following the faint trail that seemed to be leading me deeper into the wilderness. The further I went, the more unsettling it became. The trees grew thicker, blocking out more of the sunlight. The ground became softer, and the air seemed heavier. I kept thinking I heard something. Footsteps, maybe, or the rustle of someone moving through the leaves. But every time I stopped to listen, the sound would stop, leaving only silence. Then I found it. There was a small clearing up ahead, a place where the trees parted just enough to let in the light. But it wasn't the clearing that caught my attention. It was the tent. It was a small, old-fashioned tent, pitched at the far edge of the clearing. It was tattered, the fabric worn and faded, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. A fire pit sat in front of it, cold and unused. No signs of life, no one around. I froze. Something didn't feel right. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to turn back to the main trail, to get out of there. But my feet were rooted to the ground, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what had brought me here, to this forgotten place in the woods. I slowly approached the tent, half expecting someone to jump out and confront me. But no one did. The tent was empty. I circled it, inspecting it from every angle. There was nothing in it, no sleeping bag, no gear. Just an old, abandoned shell of a shelter. I bent down to examine the ground near the tent. That's when I saw it. A small, crudely drawn symbol in the dirt, a circle with lines radiating out from the center. It looked like something you would find in an old book about ancient rituals or survival tactics. But it didn't look natural. It looked wrong. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just a random abandoned camp. It was something else. Something someone had left behind for a reason. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from here as possible. I turned quickly and made my way back to the trail, my breath coming fast and shallow. The thought of being in that place for 1 second longer was unbearable. I didn't look back. I made it back to my campsite, packed up my gear, and left without another thought. I didn't care about finishing my hike, about enjoying the solitude anymore. I just wanted out of the woods. The air felt suffocating, the trees closing in around me. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The world seemed normal again. I had made it back to civilization. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was still out there in the woods, waiting, and I had a sinking feeling that I hadn't seen the last of it. The days leading up to the camping trip had been full of nothing but stress. Work was draining, and life outside of it felt like an endless series of tasks. I was desperate for an escape, something simple, away from the noise. So when I found an old campsite tucked away in the woods, I decided it would be the perfect place to unwind. A weekend alone with just me, nature, and the quiet. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. It wasn't like I had close friends who would be concerned anyway. No one to check in on me, no one to call. I preferred it that way. The last thing I wanted was someone trying to join me on my solitary retreat. I packed my gear, a couple of days' worth of food, and a sleeping bag. Nothing fancy, just the essentials. I didn't need anything else. The drive to the campsite was long. I passed through small towns, then forests, and eventually the road narrowed into a dirt path. The deeper I went, the less I saw of civilization. It was quiet, too quiet. That's when the uneasy feeling began creeping into my chest. I've always been an adventurer, but this was different. It wasn't the kind of solitude I was used to. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The place was small, an open clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a small creek trickling through the far end. There was an old fire pit in the center, stones arranged in a rough circle, and a couple of rusted metal stakes scattered around. No signs of other campers or recent visitors, which I found comforting in a way. I could already feel the stress starting to leave my body. The air here cooler, fresher. Setting up my tent didn't take long. I unpacked my gear and laid out everything I needed. I wanted to take a walk to really experience the woods, so I grabbed my water bottle, a knife I always carried for safety, and a flashlight just in case it got dark before I returned. As I walked through the woods, I couldn't help but notice how the trees seemed to form a tight, almost oppressive canopy overhead. The sunlight filtered through the branches in patches, but it was clear that this part of the forest didn't see much direct light. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The path was narrow and overgrown with thorns. I brushed past them, ignoring the mild sting, focusing on the stillness around me. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant call of a bird. For a while, I didn't even know where I was going. I just walked, following whatever path felt right, enjoying the peace that came with the isolation. But then, I came across something strange. I was nearing a small ridge when I saw something on the ground, half hidden by fallen leaves. At first, I thought it was just a piece of wood or a broken branch. But when I got closer, I realized it was a bone, a human bone. It wasn't like the ones you see in movies, all white and pristine. This was darkened with age, the edges worn smooth. I stopped, heart pounding in my chest, the reality of what I was looking at sinking in. It didn't make sense. Why would a bone be out here, alone? I looked around, but there was nothing else to indicate what might have happened. I took a step back, eyes scanning the forest, but the trees offered no answers. I had two choices: turn around and go back, or keep moving forward. My curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and carefully moved some of the leaves aside. There were more bones beneath them, not many, but enough to make my stomach turn. I stood up quickly, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some old bone left behind. Felt wrong, but I had to keep moving. I couldn't just run off in fear. So, I took one last glance at the spot, then turned around and headed back the way I came. The walk back to the campsite felt different. The air seemed heavier, and the forest around me suddenly felt far less welcoming. Every rustling leaf and snap of a twig seemed like it was right behind me, too close. My heart was racing, but I pushed the fear down. It was just my imagination. I had to be careful not to let it control me. When I made it back to my tent, I felt a bit better. The fire was already starting to die down, and the shadows in the woods were lengthening as the sun set. I built up the fire again, adding more wood and getting it to crackle. The warmth from the flames helped calm my nerves, but there was still a tightness in my chest that wouldn't go away. I sat there for a while, staring into the fire. The darkness around me seemed to grow deeper, and the sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves, faded into an almost eerie silence. Felt like I was being watched. The thought was irrational, but it wouldn't leave me. My mind kept returning to the bones in the woods, and I couldn't stop imagining how they had ended up there. Eventually, the exhaustion from the day set in. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to fall asleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The small sounds of the night, the wind in the trees, the occasional movement outside the tent, kept me awake, my mind spinning. I was too far from civilization, too far from help. If something went wrong, there would be no one around to hear me scream. Sometime during the night, I woke up to the sound of something scratching at the side of my tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. I knew what it sounded like. Deliberate, slow, like fingers dragging across the fabric. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I lay perfectly still, trying not to make a sound. The scratching continued for what felt like forever. I thought about grabbing the knife I'd brought, but that would give away the fact that I was still awake. And if it was just an animal, I didn't want to scare it off. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it had started. For a while, there was nothing. Then, a soft thud, like something heavy falling to the ground just outside my tent. My breath came in shallow gasps as I held still, waiting. I didn't know what to do. Should I peek outside? Should I just wait until morning? I stayed in the tent, not moving, not making a sound. Eventually, the noises stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the fabric of the tent above me, listening for any further sounds. But the night passed without incident. The next morning, I packed up my gear in a hurry, more out of instinct than actual thought. I didn't want to stick around any longer. The sun was high in the sky, and I could feel the heat of the day creeping in, but I had no intention of staying one more night. Just as I was about to leave, I heard something in the distance, a rustling, a crack of a branch being stepped on. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, only the trees. I grabbed my things and didn't look back. The drive back felt longer than the way in. The unease didn't leave me, and I kept looking in my rearview mirror as though expecting someone, or something, to be following me. I didn't understand what had happened, but I knew one thing. I wasn't coming back to this place, ever. I got home that evening, exhausted, but the real weight didn't hit me until I walked through the door. I felt safe. I felt relieved. It was over. The trip had been a mistake, but at least it was done. And then I remembered the bones. The thought flashed in my mind, and I suddenly felt a chill run down my spine. What if they weren't just some old remains? What if someone or something had left them there for a reason? I shook my head, trying to shake off the thought. There was nothing more to it. I had come back safe, and that was all that mattered. But even as I sat down, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then, just as I was starting to feel like I could relax, I heard something from outside, a scratching, the same slow, deliberate sound. It was coming from my window.